Hollywood in the 1960s was a place where the old rules were breaking down and nobody had agreed on what the new ones would be. The studios were losing their grip, and a new generation of actresses was living openly in ways that their predecessors had been forced to hide. Some of them became legends for their talent. Some became legends for something else entirely. Here are the 10 most promiscuous women of 1960s Hollywood, then and now in 2026. Number 10. Marilyn Monroe. She had already become the most famous woman in America before the 1960s began, but the early years of that decade were when her private life overtook everything else. By 1960, she was finishing The Misfits. Her marriage to Arthur Miller was ending, and the affairs, with Frank Sinatra, with Yves Montand, with others, were the kind of open secrets that Hollywood ran on. Born Norma Jean Mortensen in Los Angeles on June 1, 1926, Monroe had spent her childhood moving between foster homes and an orphanage after her mother was institutionalized. She was married at 16 to a neighbor's son named James Dougherty, partly to keep her out of the orphanage system. She modeled, she was discovered, and she became, through a combination of raw physical magnetism, comedic genius, and a particular kind of damaged openness, one of the most compelling screen presences the medium has ever produced. Her marriages were the visible structure of a romantic life that operated on a much larger scale beneath the surface. Joe DiMaggio in 1954 divorced after 9 months over his jealousy of her career and her public persona. Arthur Miller in 1956, an intellectually serious match that dissolved under the weight of her deteriorating mental health and his inability to fix what he couldn't right. Between and around those marriages were relationships with men whose names filled columns across every newspaper in the country. Her affair with Yves Montand during the filming of Let's Make Love in 1960 was conducted with almost no pretense of discretion, at a time when Montand's wife, Simone Signoret, was one of the most respected actresses in Europe and had just won the Academy Award for Best Actress for Room at the Top. The contrast, the celebrated serious actress and the American bombshell, was not lost on anyone covering the story. The relationship with President John F. Kennedy and the subsequent involvement with his brother Robert were in a different category. They carried political weight that the studio affairs had not, and they were known to enough people in Washington and Hollywood that the secrecy surrounding them was always fragile. Her performance of Happy Birthday at Madison Square Garden in May 1962, breathy, sequined, unmistakably charged, was watched by the president himself from the audience. Marilyn Monroe died on August 4, 1962, in Brentwood, California, at the age of 36. The cause was ruled a probable overdose of barbiturates. She had been dismissed from the set of Something's Got to Give by Fox earlier that year. The circumstances of her death have been debated for more than 6 decades, and the debate shows no sign of stopping. Number 9. Elizabeth Taylor. Elizabeth Taylor's romantic life in the 1960s was not a scandal so much as a running serial, a story that the global press followed with the kind of attention normally reserved for international crises. She was married 8 times in total, and the decade of the 60s contained 3 of those marriages, plus the most talked-about love affair in Hollywood history. Born in London on February 27, 1932, to American parents, she had been a child star at MGM and a teenage sensation in National Velvet. By the time she arrived at the 1960s, she had already been married 3 times, to Nikki Hilton, to Michael Wilding, and to Mike Todd, who died in a plane crash in 1958, leaving her a widow at 26. She then married Eddie Fisher, Todd's best friend, and at the time, the husband of Debbie Reynolds, one of America's most beloved performers. The Fisher marriage destroyed his career and made Taylor one of the most publicly condemned women in America, temporarily. Then came Cleopatra in Rome and Richard Burton, and the condemnation evaporated in the heat of something that was simply too large to sustain moral judgment. Burton was married to Sybil Williams. Taylor was married to Fisher. Neither fact slowed anything down. The photographs of the two of them on set circulated worldwide. The Vatican issued a public statement describing Taylor's conduct as erotic vagrancy, a phrase that she reportedly received with amusement. She divorced Fisher, married Burton in 1964, divorced him in 1974, remarried him in 1975, and divorced him again in 1976. Between and after Burton came John Warner, the Virginia politician she married in 1976 and divorced in 1982, and Larry Fortensky, the construction worker she met in rehab and married in 1991 at Michael Jackson's Neverland Ranch, divorced in 1996. Throughout the decade, Taylor also maintained close relationships with men outside her marriages: Montgomery Clift, whom she loved in a way that defied easy categorization, and Frank Sinatra, and others whose names surfaced less publicly. She was not discreet so much as defiant, a woman who had decided early that the rules being applied to her were not rules she had agreed to follow. Elizabeth Taylor died on March 23, 2011 in Los Angeles at the age of 79. Number 8. Kim Novak. Kim Novak was Columbia Pictures' answer to Marilyn Monroe, a blonde, luminous, physically extraordinary actress whom the studio signed in 1954 and promoted relentlessly. Whether she wanted the attention or not, she often did not. The tension between the image the studio manufactured and the person underneath it ran through her entire career. Born Marilyn Pauline Novak in Chicago on February 13, 1933, she had come to Hollywood as a model and been spotted by a Columbia talent scout. Harry Cohn, the notoriously autocratic studio head, took a personal and controlling interest in her development, an interest that went beyond professional mentorship and that Novak, in later years, described in ways that left little ambiguity about its nature. Her affair with Sammy Davis Jr. in 1957 became one of the most discussed interracial relationships in Hollywood at a time when such relationships carried genuine social and professional risk for both parties. Harry Cohn intervened, according to multiple accounts, with threats delivered through intermediaries, and the relationship ended. Davis married a white actress named Lorraine White shortly afterward, in circumstances that most accounts describe as an arranged solution to the pressure being applied from multiple directions, including reportedly from mob figures with financial interests in Davis's career. Her later relationship with the French actor and director Mathieu Carrière and her marriage to the British actor Richard Johnson, they married in 1965 and divorced in 1966, added to a personal life that was regularly discussed in the press. She was linked publicly to Frank Sinatra, to Cary Grant, and to Ali Khan during the decade. Vertigo in 1958, directed by Alfred Hitchcock, gave her the role that eventually eclipsed everything else in her biography, a dual performance of such strange, hypnotic precision that critics who had dismissed her as a studio creation were forced to reconsider. She played two characters simultaneously, a woman who may or may not be who she says she is, and the ghost of someone else entirely, and held the tension between them for the full length of a film that asks its audience to suspend a great deal and rewards them for it. The film was poorly received on release and has since been ranked among the greatest films ever made by critics and scholars across multiple generations. Her other significant 1960s work included Boys' Night Out in 1962 and Of Human Bondage in 1964, in which she played Mildred Rogers. a role that had defined Bette Davis's early career, with a rawness that earned her respect from critics who had spent years writing her off. The performance demonstrated a range that Columbia's marketing had consistently buried under its own manufactured image of her. She married actor Richard Johnson in May 1965. The marriage ended in divorce in 1966, a span of months, not years, and Johnson later married actress Noel Harrison's ex-wife. Novak did not remarry until 1976, when she wed veterinarian Robert Malloy. That marriage lasted until his death in 2020, 44 years. After stepping away from Hollywood in the early 1970s, Novak moved to a farm in Oregon and largely left the entertainment industry behind. She has lived quietly since, painting, raising horses, appearing occasionally at retrospectives of her work. She is 93 years old in 2026. Number 7. Joan Collins. Joan Collins arrived in Hollywood from England in the early 1950s with the kind of dark, sharp beauty that the studios recognized immediately and deployed accordingly. She was cast as temptresses and bad girls and dangerous women throughout the decade, which suited her, and the roles suited her, better than the ingenue parts that were being handed to softer-looking actresses at the same time. Born in London on May 23, 1933, Collins came from a show business family. Her father was a theatrical agent and had trained at the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art before signing with the Rank Organization and then with 20th Century Fox, which brought her to Hollywood. She appeared opposite Paul Newman in Rally Round the Flag, Boys, in 1958, and in a string of films through the early 60s that cast her primarily on the basis of how she looked, which was spectacular, while underusing what she could actually do. Her romantic life throughout the 1950s and 1960s was conducted at full visibility. She was engaged to Maxwell Reed, who became her first husband in 1952 and whom she later described as having essentially sold her to an Arab sheikh for the evening, a detail she included in her autobiography without particular softening. She was briefly engaged to Arthur Lowe Jr. She had a long relationship with Warren Beatty, who was at the time one of the most sought-after men in Hollywood, and whose own romantic history was so extensive that it eventually became the subject of substantial published reporting. She was married to Anthony Newley from 1963 to 1971 and had 2 children with him. Her 1960s film work included The Road to Hong Kong in 1962 and Warning Shot in 1967, but it was her willingness to take on roles that other actresses avoided in British horror films, in international productions, that kept her working when the Fox contract ended. The role that made her a second-generation household name, Alexis Carrington on Dynasty, which she joined in 1981 and which ran until 1989. Joan Collins is 92 years old in 2026. She was made a Dame Commander of the Order of the British Empire in 2015, which she has described as one of the things she is most proud of. Number 6. Brigitte Bardot. Few women in the history of cinema were as publicly associated with sexual freedom as Brigitte Bardot, not because she sought the association, but because she embodied something that the 1960s was trying to become and hadn't quite managed yet. Born Camille Javal in Paris on September 28, 1934, to a wealthy bourgeois family, she trained as a ballet dancer and appeared on the cover of Elle at 15. Her marriage to director Roger Vadim at 18 produced And God Created Woman in 1956, which turned the fishing village of Saint-Tropez into a destination and turned Bardot into an international icon before she was 25. By the 1960s, her relationships were tracked as closely in France as any political story. Her affair with actor Jacques Charrier led to their marriage in 1959 and a son, Nicolas Jacques Charrier, born in January 1960. The marriage lasted a year. Her subsequent relationship with German millionaire Günther Sachs, who reportedly dropped hundreds of roses on her house from a helicopter and hired a brass band to serenade her, led to their marriage in 1966, which lasted until 1969. Between those relationships were affairs that the French press catalogued with the kind of thoroughness usually applied to state business. Simone de Beauvoir wrote an essay in 1959 analyzing what Bardot represented: a woman who refused the social transaction of trading freedom for security, who was unapologetic about desire, and who made that refusal visible in a way that unsettled both men who wanted her and women who were expected to disapprove of her. She retired from film in 1973 at 39 and has devoted the decade since to animal rights advocacy. She is 91 years old in 2026, living in Saint-Tropez. Number 5. Jane Mansfield. Jane Mansfield understood exactly what she was doing. She was not a passive subject of the male gaze. She was an active manager of her own image, a woman who had studied the mechanics of celebrity and applied them with a precision that the people who dismissed her as a dumb blonde consistently underestimated. Born Vera Jane Palmer in Bryn Mawr, Pennsylvania, on April 19, 1933, she had an IQ that was reportedly tested at 163, spoke 5 languages, and played both violin and piano. She had her first child at 17, put herself through acting classes while raising a baby, and developed a performance of femininity so exaggerated that it functioned as both a commercial product and a commentary on the product. Her marriages, Paul Mansfield from 1950 to 1958, Mickey Hargitay from 1958 to 1964, Matt Cimber from 1964 to 1966, bracketed a romantic life that operated well beyond their boundaries. Her relationships with Frank Sinatra, with John F. Kennedy, and with attorney Sam Brody, who was with her at the time of her death, were discussed openly in the press. Her affair with Brody was particularly public and particularly turbulent. Anton LaVey, the founder of the Church of Satan and a personal acquaintance of Mansfield's, reportedly placed a curse on Brody when the relationship developed, a detail that has attached itself to her story ever since, regardless of its verifiability. She was a Playboy playmate in February 1955, the first actress to appear in a major Hollywood studio film, Promises in 1963, and a performer who understood that the line between serious actress and cultural spectacle was something the industry drew and she could choose to ignore. Jane Mansfield died on June 29, 1967, in a car accident outside New Orleans at the age of 34. Sam Brody was driving. 3 of her children were in the back seat and survived. She was en route to a television appearance. Number 4. Mamie Van Doren. If Marilyn Monroe was the platinum ideal and Jane Mansfield was the comic exaggeration, Mamie Van Doren occupied a 3rd position, the one who worked hardest, complained least, and lasted longest in the role. Born Joan Lucille Olander in Rowena, South Dakota, on February 6, 1931, she moved with her family to California as a teenager, sang with a big band, won beauty contests, and signed with Universal Pictures in 1953. The studio positioned her as a Monroe alternative. The same bleached hair, the same exaggerated proportions, a slightly harder edge, and she appeared in a string of films through the late 1950s and into the 1960s that capitalized on exactly that positioning. Untamed Youth in 1957, High School Confidential in 1958, Girls Town in 1959. The titles alone communicate the territory the studio had staked out for her. Her 1960s film work included Kittens Go to College in 1960, which did exactly what the title promised, and The Navy versus the Night Monsters in 1966, which demonstrated the range of projects that came her way as the decade progressed, and the original Monroe rival positioning became harder to sustain commercially. She adapted, taking television appearances, stage work, international productions, with more flexibility than the industry gave her credit for. Her off-screen life in the 1960s was as heavily reported as her on-screen work. She was linked to Joe Namath and to Bo Belinsky, the baseball pitcher she dated seriously for several years, and whose own tabloid profile made him a natural match for hers in the press. Her 1987 memoir, Playing the Field, named names with a directness that publishing lawyers had presumably reviewed carefully, and the names included enough well-known figures from entertainment and sports to generate significant press coverage on publication. She was married 7 times in total, to bandleader Johnny Davis, to musician Ray Anthony, with whom she had a son, and to several others across the decade and beyond. Unlike many of her contemporaries, Van Doren worked consistently through the 1960s, 1970s, and beyond, accepting whatever the industry was offering, adjusting to each decade's version of what her image meant, and never quite disappearing. Mamie Van Doren is 94 years old in 2026 and remains one of the last surviving figures from the era of the Hollywood blonde bombshell. Number 3. Ava Gardner. Ava Gardner did not particularly care what anyone thought about her, which was probably the most radical thing about her in an industry built on managing other people's opinions. She drank, she danced, she had the relationship she wanted, and she left Hollywood for Madrid and then London when she found the place suffocating. Born on December 24, 1922, in Grabtown, North Carolina, a place so small it was named after the act of grabbing land, she was one of 7 children of a sharecropper. A talent scout saw her photograph in a shop window in New York and arranged a screen test. MGM signed her in 1941. She spent the early years of her contract learning the trade and being tested for one type of role after another before landing The Killers in 1946, which made her a genuine star. Her marriages were 3 in total and constituted a significant chapter of mid-century Hollywood history. Mickey Rooney from 1942 to 1943, Artie Shaw from 1945 to 1946, and Frank Sinatra from 1951 to 1957. The Sinatra marriage was the most consequential and the most turbulent. He was, by multiple accounts, the man she loved most completely, and the relationship was defined by a mutual intensity that made coexistence very difficult. They divorced in 1957, but remained connected in various ways for the rest of their lives. Her romantic life in the 1960s continued in Madrid, where she had moved in the mid-1950s, largely to be around the bullfighting world she had fallen in love with. Her relationship with Luis Miguel Dominguín, one of the greatest matadors of the era, and also, simultaneously, the lover of Ava Gardner and later the husband of actress Lucia Bosé, was replaced by other relationships in the Spanish cultural world. She was in her late 30s and 40s during the decade, and she made several significant films. On the Beach in 1959, 55 Days at Peking in 1963, The Night of the Iguana in 1964. Ava Gardner moved to London in 1968 and spent the last 2 decades of her life there, in a flat in Ennismore Gardens in Knightsbridge. She continued working. Earthquake in 1974, The Sentinel in 1977, a television miniseries version of Roots in 1977, and Knots Landing in the 1980s, maintaining a professional life even as her health declined. She had suffered a series of strokes in her later years. Her autobiography, Ava, My Story, was published posthumously in 1990, the year she died, and was written with a frankness about her life and the men in it that reflected the same indifference to other people's judgment she had displayed throughout her career. She died on January 25, 1990, in London at the age of 67 from pneumonia. She is buried in Smithfield, North Carolina, her home state, in the cemetery of the Grabtown Baptist Church, not far from where she was born. Number 2. Tuesday Weld. Tuesday Weld was one of those figures who was famous during the 1960s in a way that is difficult to reconstruct from the outside. Famous for her talent, famous for her wildness, famous for a quality of self-destructive electricity that the press covered extensively and that the industry was simultaneously drawn to and afraid of. Born Susan Kerr Weld in New York City on August 27, 1943, she began modeling at 3 to help support her family after her father died. She was earning a substantial income as a child model before she was 10. She had what she later described as a nervous breakdown at 9, began drinking at 10, and attempted suicide at 12. A biographical detail that tends to recontextualize everything that followed. She became a minor celebrity as a teenager through a string of appearances on The Bob Cummings Show starting in 1955, and then built a film career through the late 1950s and 1960s in projects that consistently did better by her than most of the films she appeared in deserved. She turned down the roles of Lolita in Stanley Kubrick's 1962 film, which went to Sue Lyon, and Bonnie Parker in Bonnie and Clyde, which went to Faye Dunaway. Both decisions, whatever their reasoning, are the kind that get debated endlessly by people interested in what her career might have been under different circumstances. Pretty Poison in 1968, in which she played a teenager of cheerful, murderous intent opposite Anthony Perkins, is the film most often cited as proof of what she could actually do. A performance of terrifying lightness that suggested a major actress who had mostly been wasted on lesser material. The film was barely released and found its reputation entirely through rediscovery, which has been the pattern of her career more broadly. Her personal life was reported extensively throughout the decade. Relationships with Elvis Presley, with John Ireland, with an assortment of musicians and actors whose names appeared regularly in the columns. She married screenwriter Claude Hartz in 1965, had a daughter named Natasha with him, and divorced in 1971. She later married Dudley Moore in 1975, had a son named Patrick with him, and divorced in 1980. She received an Academy Award nomination for Looking for Mr. Goodbar in 1977, which was another film that used her particular quality. The sense of someone operating at a slightly different register from everyone else on screen, to real effect. Tuesday, Weld is 82 years old in 2026 and has been largely absent from public life for decades. Number 1. Lana Turner. Lana Turner's life contained more drama than most of her films, which is saying something because her films were not short on drama. By the time the 1960s began, she had been through 6 marriages, a scandal that had nearly ended her career, and a comeback that proved she was more durable than anyone had predicted. Born Julia Jean Turner in Wallace, Idaho on February 8, 1921, she was discovered, according to the story that became legend, sitting at the counter of a drugstore on Sunset Boulevard at 16, though she said it was actually the Top Hat Cafe across from Hollywood High School. A reporter named Billy Wilkerson spotted her, introduced her to talent agent Zeppo Marx, and she was signed to Warner Brothers before the year was out. Her marriages, 7 in total, read like a catalog of a particular kind of 1940s and 1950s masculinity. Artie Shaw in 1940, Stephen Crane in 1942, Henry J. Topping in 1948, Lex Barker in 1953, Fred May in 1960, Robert Eaton in 1965, and Ronald Dante in 1969. The marriage to Lex Barker ended after her daughter Cheryl Crane alleged that Barker had sexually abused her, an allegation that became public and that Turner addressed. The scandal that defined her public image arrived on April 4, 1958, when her daughter Cheryl Crane stabbed Turner's then-boyfriend, mobster Johnny Stompanato, to death in the bedroom of their Beverly Hills home. Turner had been in a volatile relationship with Stompanato for 2 years. The coroner's inquest ruled the killing justifiable homicide. Turner's testimony at the inquest, delivered in a performance of grief so complete that some observers were unsure whether they were watching a real woman or an actress who had internalized her craft completely, was, by multiple accounts, the most riveting thing she had ever done in public. Her 1960s films included Portrait in Black in 1960, Bachelor in Paradise in 1961, and Madam X in 1966, which gave her one of her finest later performances. Lana Turner died on June 29, 1995, in Century City, California, at the age of 74. The cause was throat cancer. Hollywood in the 1960s was a place of genuine transformation. The old studio system breaking apart, the production code losing its grip, and a generation of women living in the open in ways that the decade before them had made nearly impossible. Some of these women were reckless, some were defiant, some were simply living their lives in an industry that put everything under a magnifying glass and called the result a scandal. The press that covered them and the public that consumed those stories were participating in something that said as much about the era as it did about the women themselves. Several are gone: Monroe at 36, Mansfield at 34, Gardner at 67, Turner at 74. A few are still here: Van Doren at 94, Novak at 93, Collins at 92, Weld at 82. The ones who survived largely did so on their own terms, which was, in the end, what most of them had been fighting for all along. If this kind of Hollywood history is what brings you here, hit that like button and subscribe. There is a lot more of it coming.